evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ken Macintosh. I'm the presiding officer here at the Scottish Parliament, and it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you this evening. I'm also, as well as being presiding officer, I'm chair of the Parliament's Futures Forum. That is the Parliament's own think tank, and that is the context in which we're here tonight. The forum, Futures Forum, has organised a programme of events over this session in which we look at and we try to imagine and look forward to life in Scotland in the year 2030. And in particular we look at how we might discuss issues here in Parliament, out with the parliamentary cycle, out with the party political nature that the election cycle tends to throw upon us. This year in particular, as part of that 2030 programme, we've been looking at life in future Scotland. Birth, life, and this evening, death in future Scotland. And if I may say so, the event is both about our guest here, but it's also about you. So we're looking for you to make observations, ask questions, perhaps not many speeches, but certainly a few observations yourself on how we might approach this subject. It's a difficult subject to talk about. It's one we avoid talking about. But we want to have these discussions here in the Parliament so that we can talk about how Scotland comes to terms with the issues of death and dying in the year 2030, and what perhaps the Parliament as an institution can do about it, how we might shape or influence that future Scotland. So I'm delighted to have as our guest this evening to talk about this subject, Richard Holloway. And many of you will know Richard, a former Bishop of Edinburgh. He's a regular contributor to the BBC. He's also a writer and author. He's patron of LGBT Scotland. He's the chair of Sistema Scotland. He was, until very recently, I have to confess, on the board of Future Scotland. So he is very much part of our society here in Scotland, part of our discussions around how we shape that society. He's also, having chaired the British Medical Association Steering Group on Ethics and Genetics, and as a member of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, he's no stranger to discussing or wrestling with difficult moral and ethical issues. So I believe he's the perfect person to lead us in our discussion tonight. These are issues in particular he has aired in his most recent book, Waiting for the Last Bus. So I think many of you will already have read this, and if not, hopefully you will. It's a fantastic read, I have to say, a really stimulating read. It's been shortlisted, in fact, for the Saltire Literary Awards. So, on that note, can I ask Richard to address us and give a short presentation on some of his thoughts, which is outlined in his book, and from that we'll take this on. Richard.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you all for turning out. In 1897, Paul Gauguin, the painter, heard in Tahiti, he'd left his wife, his family, and he'd gone to Tahiti, and he heard, probably months after it happened, that his favourite daughter, Aline, had died. And his response was a colossal painting that hangs in a gallery in Boston in Massachusetts. And on the top left-hand corner, he slashed, I mean, it is a real slash, 3 questions. What are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Of course, they're not just Gauguin's questions, they're humanity's questions, because we are a strange animal. In us, the evolution of our big brains has caused us to be a reflective, thinking animal, unlike the other animals that we share the planet with, who seem to be at ease in their lives. They seem to lack our reflective capacity to worry about it, to wonder whether they ask these questions, what are we, where do we come from, where are we going? But something's happened to us that makes us an object of interest to ourselves, and of course the universe itself. Where did it come from? Where is it going? What does it mean? These come with our humanity, these questions, and they're inescapable. And one of the things that seems to have prompted a lot of this thinking is the fact that we probably are the only animal on the planet that knows it's going to die. It's hard to get into the spiritual, the inner life of the other animals, and I think we're very arrogantly dismissive of the possibility that they may have a level of inner reality. But we certainly are the noted animal for this, and we do know we're going to die. There's a couple of lines from Edgar Allan Poe, the American writer. From a proud tower in the town, death looks gigantically down. And that is the experience of being human. We know that we are all on the way to death. I want to reflect on the way humanity has handled that and end by looking at current responses to it. But until fairly recently, it was religion, in a sense, that was the great interpreter and indeed administrator of death. It kept death before us. It had an art of death called Ars Moriendi, the art of dying. One of its mottos was Memento Mori, remember to die, remember that you are a dying animal. And it also had a series of parables or theories of judgment. Most of the big religions have versions of judgment, whether it's karma, whether it's heaven and hell, whatever it is. There was a sense in which this was a probationary period, and on the way you lived it dictated what happened after it, whether it was reincarnation or whether it was judgment to hell or to heaven. It was religion that kept death before our eyes. That's shifted today, both with the decline of religion and a number of other factors. And the agents of our death today are unlikely to be priests, they're more likely to be doctors. Doctors have become the great ministers of our dying, and the emphasis within the medical profession is not on preparing us to die, but on delaying that fact as long as possible, sometimes beyond rationality. Here's a quote from an American physician, Atul Gawande, who wrote a book recently called Being Mortal, because the medical profession itself is worried about this phenomenon, this resistance beyond the point of sanity to the inexorable fact of death. And Gawande writes these words: medicine exists to fight death and disease, but you want someone who knows how to fight territory that can be won, and how to surrender when it can't. Someone who understands that the damage is greater if all you do is battle to the bitter end. That's from a physician who works in hospice care and palliative care, who knows the dynamic of what's happening in our world at the moment. But I want to be fair, keeping us alive well into our 80s, and I'll be 85 at the end of this month, is one of the successes of modern medicine. But there are signs it's having a profoundly distorting effect on the balance of society as a whole. And my little book, I've gone round talking about death and dying, and I'm beginning to detect a kind of what I think of as a revolt of the geriatrics. A revolt against their death and dying being managed by doctors. One of them is Barbara Ehrenreich, who's an American prophet in a way. She's got a doctorate in biology, and she's actually quite a crusading journalist against much that she thinks is wrong in American culture. And she's onto this at the moment. She's written a book called Natural Causes. And this is one of the things that she says about, she's in her late 70s. She says, not only do I reject the torment of a medicalized death, but I refuse to accept a medicalized life. And my determination only deepens with age. As the time that remains to me shrinks, each month and day becomes too precious to spend in windowless waiting rooms and under the cold scrutiny of machines. Being old enough to die is an achievement, not a defeat, and the freedom it brings is worth celebrating. I buy that. I intend to leave instructions. I don't want to die wired up to a machine. I know where I want to die. I know the room I want to die in. I know the street corner I want to look out on. I'm going to take my death back to me and away from a medical profession that sometimes is too dominantly controlling. But something else has happened to death that's even more worrying than the fact that we're being kept alive, many of us, too long. And let me back up a little bit and meditate on us again as these clever humans that we are. We're the cleverest animal on the planet, but we're a very unwise animal. And we know this from our own history. We're a very violent animal. The most violent century in human history was just the last century, the 20th century. We don't really learn. We invent new ways of doing things, but we never anticipate the consequences, the impact it will have. Just think of the impact of endless industrial revolutions and the discarding of whole communities that results. And we have a problem of entrenched poverty in Scotland related to that, the death of heavy industry, steelworks. We know we do this all the time. We run ahead of ourselves in the brave things we invent, and in the process, we don't figure out the impact it's going to have on the human community. Think of one or two of them. I chaired an event at the end of last month with Sir Michael Atiyah, former president of the Royal Society, probably the most distinguished scientist alive at the moment. And he said a very significant thing. He was asked about the wars in the Middle East. And he said the great tragedy was the discovery of oil. That's what's killing the Middle East at the moment, and our greed for it, and the effect it's had on the planet. So it is entirely possible that our cleverness, our lack of wisdom, would destroy the very planet that's given us life. And the astronomer royal himself gives us 50-50 chance of surviving. And again, it's this cleverness of ours that runs ahead of human wisdom. So be wary. It could be that the next revolution is the one that actually does bring about our destruction. There's a little angle, a little aspect of religion that's worth thinking about here. If you look back into human history, you'll discover various myths, various religious tropes that indicate a deep anxiety in the human about what it's up to. And one of them is apocalyptic fear. There is in human history this notion of the end time, that things will finish. Very often they're supernaturally conceived that God will erupt. But there's also a subtext that we ourselves will end it, that we will finish ourselves off simply because we are unmanageable animals. And what seems to me to be most worrying about death today is not the scientific attempt to delay it. I think we can agree that that is a good thing up to a certain level. Barbara Ehrenreich quotes a Silicon Valley billionaire, and beware of Silicon Valley billionaires. They've already mucked the world up considerably in the last 10 years. So just think what they might conceivably do in the future. She quotes a Silicon Valley billionaire who says, "Death makes me very angry." And there is now a movement in California to do away with death, not to delay it, not to postpone it, but to finish it off. And there are a number of scientific activities going on. Two of them I want to look at. The first one I think isn't going to work. It's called cryopreservation. You've probably heard about this. You get your corpse drained of blood and filled with antifreeze. You're tucked inside a cylinder, upside down. The basic version costs $200,000. They drain your blood, and the idea is that the patient in their lexicon will be thawed out and come back to life when the disease that killed them is cured. There's a cheaper version that costs $80,000. This is called neuro-only, and it's your head that's preserved. And the idea, and this could be coming, it's called transhumanism. The idea is that when you're thawed out, your mind, your brain will be digitally scanned, purged of any unnecessary neurojunk, and the good stuff left will be uploaded onto an artificial body or robotic prosthesis, and you will exist forever. It's not an existence I fancy. It's actually called transhumanism. It's called the new singularity, and there are serious people thinking and plotting this. Now, my hunch is that won't work. My hunch is that the next thing will work. There's a lot of funding going into what they call longevity escape velocity. It works like this. Every year that passes, The process of longevity research is such that average life expectancy increases by more than a year. See where we're going? So you keep ahead of the Grim Reaper, a situation that would in theory lead to our effectively outrunning death. Now, I can't believe that that will happen, but I do believe there's a lot of research going into it. I do believe we will enhance our longevity significantly, maybe up to 200 or 300 years. Now that's what I want you to imagine. A universe in which we didn't die. One guy in California reckons he could make it to 1,000 years. Even if we only make it to 150, just think of the impact of that. It would be a kind of geriatric apocalypse, wouldn't it? And the fact that we're living as long as we are is already having significant political and social effects. So I think we should be worried about this. And again, it echoes an ancient human angle. There's a myth in which Tithonus asks for immortality, and he gets it, but he forgets to ask for eternal youth. And so he just lives forever, getting older and older and older. Tennyson wrote a wee poem about it. Here's a wee clip from it. The woods decay and fall, the vapours weep their burthen to the ground. Man comes and tills the field and lies beneath, and after many summers dies the swan. Me only cruel immortality consumes. I wither slowly in thine arms, a white-haired shadow roaming like a dream, the ever-silent spaces of the east. Imagine what that would be like. Never being able to die, just deteriorating physically. Actually, it doesn't take a lot of imagination, because the karma of modern medicine keeps too many people alive long after any pleasure or meaning has gone from their lives. Sentenced to years of mournful disillusion. There are parts of Florida where the wealthy old go not to die, but to be kept pickled indefinitely. And in America, what they call the medical industrial complex makes money out of that. And it's not really an existence. I can't afford it anyway, but it's certainly not an existence I fancy. So we might, it seems to me, be finally reaching the end of our cleverness. And because we do not anticipate it and can't humbly accept our finitude, our mortality, the fact that death was always in the script, and we should take our bow and bugger off when the time comes, the fact that we're not doing that could suggest that we may in fact be stoking the ultimate mistake, the ultimate human mistake. That's why I want to close with a prayer. The American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote a prayer that was taken over by Alcoholics Anonymous because it is such a wise prayer. The prayer that they adapted: God grant us the courage to change what can be changed, the serenity to accept what cannot be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference. If you live by that prayer, you live wisely. You know what's worth tackling, you know what's worth accepting, and that gives you serenity. I think a new clause might be added to the prayer to give it more relevance to the theme that I'm talking about this evening. God keep us, I'll go from the beginning. God grant us the courage to change what can be changed, the serenity to accept what cannot be changed, the wisdom to know the difference, and God keep us from the folly of interfering too much with the imperatives and contingencies of nature, lest we destroy ourselves in the process. And I'm going to end with a story from World War II. This actually happened. An elderly woman called Mrs. Fleetwood Hesketh was crossing the Atlantic to visit her evacuated daughter in Canada when her ship was torpedoed. She found herself on a lifeboat full of children and young people, and there was no room for further survivors, and more children needed to get in. So she said quite calmly, "I've had a good life, I'm near the end, goodbye," and she stepped into the sea. Now, I'm not suggesting we oldies should commit mass suicide. I'm just suggesting that we should acknowledge that we've had our time and depart gratefully when the time is up. That's me done.